On the highest ridge of my family's mountain, my son smiled and said, "Dad, step closer." The view is incredible. I thought he wanted to heal our broken relationship. Seconds later, I tumbled over the edge. Unable to move below, I heard him whisper into his phone, "It's done. He won't be coming back." I held my breath and stayed completely still, because the voice answering him revealed that this trip had never been about reconciliation. Thank you for being here with me today. Before the story continues, I'd love to hear from you. What are you doing while you listen? Driving, working, cooking, or winding down? Your presence here truly matters. Quick note, some details are fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. The message is what I hope stays with you. The call that would end my life came on a Saturday morning in October, while I was drinking coffee in the kitchen I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. I am Warren Prescott, 68 years old, a retired industrial maintenance technician who spent 38 years keeping machines running that other people built. The coffee was bitter that morning, the way I liked it, and the autumn sun came through the window at the angle that told me it was just past 9. The phone rang. I almost didn't answer. These days, most calls were robotic voices trying to sell me something I didn't need or warn me about warranties I didn't have. But the screen showed a name I hadn't seen in months: Henrik, my son, 38 years old, real estate broker. The boy I taught to ride a bike and balance a checkbook and measure twice before cutting once. His voice was warm, almost uncertain. "Did I wake you?" "No," I said, setting the coffee mug down on the counter I'd sanded and sealed myself back when my hands were steadier. "I've been up since 6. You know me." "Yeah." He laughed, and it sounded genuine. "Yeah, I do. Listen, I was thinking, when's the last time we did something together? Just the two of us." I couldn't remember. His wedding maybe, but that wasn't just us. That was Sabine and her family, and 200 people I'd never met. Before that, years. 3, at least. "It's been a while," I said. "Too long." His voice softened. "Dad, I want us to have a day just for the two of us. Like the old days. Like when I was a kid and we'd hike all day and you'd teach me the names of trees." The memory hit me like a wrench to the chest. Henrik at 7, small hand in mine, pointing at a sugar maple and asking why the leaves turned red. Me explaining chlorophyll and anthocyanins in language a child could understand. Him listening like every word I said was scripture. "I'd like that," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. "The mountain land." Henrik continued, "Your property up there. We could hike the trails like we used to. Maybe camp overnight if the weather holds. I took Friday off work. We could go next week." The mountain land. 640 acres in the Appalachian foothills inherited from my father, kept through decades of property taxes I paid, even when money was tight, because some things you don't sell. Henrik used to love it there. Before Sabine. Before the distance grew between us like a slow leak I never quite figured out how to patch. "I'll pack the gear," I said. "Same trail we used to take, Okum. Actually, I was thinking we could try the North Ridge. I've been looking at maps. There's a route I want to explore. That was different. We always hiked the southern loop, the one I'd walked with my own father when I was Henrik's age. But maybe that was the point. New trails, new start." "Sounds good," I said. There was a pause, and I heard something in the background on his end. A voice, maybe. Female. Then Henrik came back on. "Hey Dad, one more thing. Have you updated your will recently? I'm just worried about you being out there alone at your age. You know, just in case. Just in case." I should have heard the wrong note there, the dissonance. But I was 68, and my son was calling me Dad and wanting to spend a day hiking like when he was 7. I heard concern. I heard a son worried about his aging father. Updated it 6 months ago, I said. Everything's in order, don't worry. Good. That's good. He sounded relieved. I just wanted to make sure you're taken care of. You know that everything's clear. It's clear. When had the distance between us grown so wide that a simple phone call felt like a miracle? When had I started treating my own son like a stranger whose attention I had to earn? I stood there in my kitchen holding the phone and tried to remember the last time Henrik had called just to talk. Not for money, not for help fixing something, just to talk. I couldn't. I'm looking forward to it, Henrik said, and his voice was the warmest I'd heard it in years. It'll be like old times. Like old times, I repeated. We made the plans. He'd pick me up Friday morning, 6 a.m. We'd drive to the trailhead, spend the day on the mountain. Maybe he'd tell me about work, about his marriage, about whatever had been keeping him so distant these last few years. Maybe I'd tell him about the loneliness that filled the house since his mother died 4 years ago. Maybe we'd rebuild something I didn't even realize was broken. We said goodbye. He called me Dad again before hanging up. I set the phone down on the counter next to my coffee. The mug had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The bitterness felt appropriate. I should have heard what he wasn't saying. I should have counted the years since his last voluntary visit. I should have noticed the rehearsed warmth in his voice, the way he'd pivoted so smoothly to the will question the background voice that cut off mid-sentence. I should have remembered that my son, Henrik Prescott, was a real estate broker, and real estate brokers know how to sell. They know how to make you want something you didn't know you needed. They know how to close, but I heard what I wanted to hear. A son reaching out to his father. A chance to fix something that had been broken so long I'd stopped noticing the cracks. I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the autumn leaves falling in slow spirals to the ground, red and gold against the October sky. I thought maybe everything can still be fixed. I didn't know there was nothing to fix, because nothing had ever truly been whole. The boy who once held my hand on mountain trails had died years ago, and I had been too blind to attend the funeral. The man who called himself Henrik and asked about wills and planned new trails wasn't my son anymore. He was my executor. 3 weeks later, I would stand at the edge of that same mountain trail, and my son would stand behind me. The hands on my back were firm, deliberate, and unmistakable. Not a stumble, not an accident, but a push that came at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 hours into a hike I thought was about forgiveness. 3 weeks had passed since the phone call. 3 weeks of planning the trip, packing the old hiking gear, checking the weather forecast like it mattered. 3 weeks of believing my son Henrik wanted to rebuild what we'd lost. We started at 5:30 a.m. when the October fog was still thick enough to taste. The temperature gauge in my truck read 39 degrees. Henrik Prescott, 38. My only son stood beside me in the hiking boots I'd bought him 3 Christmases ago, adjusting the straps on a brand new backpack I'd never seen before. "Ready?" he asked, and his smile looked genuine in the pre-dawn light. "Ready," I said. We walked into the fog. The trail started familiar. The same granite marker my father had placed 40 years ago, moss growing thick on the north face. The same switchback where Henrik at 9 had insisted on carrying my pack to prove he was strong enough. I expected us to take the southern loop, the route we'd walked a dozen times when he was a boy. Instead, Henrik turned left at the fork. "I thought we were taking the old trail," I said. "The new route is more beautiful, Dad. Trust me. No cell service up here, but that's the point, right? Just us. Just us." I followed him into terrain I'd never walked through, fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The path narrowed. The trees grew denser. The familiar landmarks disappeared behind us like memories I was actively forgetting. He checked his phone 3 times in the first hour. Each time he frowned at the screen and put it away. So no signal, he said. Told you. Why check if you already knew? I didn't ask. I was too busy trying to keep up, trying to match the pace of a 38-year-old man, while my 68-year-old knees complained with every step. An hour into the hike, Henrik asked, "You haven't transferred any assets into trusts recently, have you? Just making sure everything's in order in case something happens." The question felt wrong, like a bolt that didn't match the thread pattern. But I was his father, and fathers answer their sons' questions. "No transfers," I said. "Everything's where it should be, in the will like I told you." "Good, that's good. Makes things simpler. Simpler for what I should have asked. I should have stopped walking and demanded to know why he needed things to be simple, why he cared about transfers and trusts on a Tuesday morning hike through fog so thick it felt like walking through someone else's dream. But I didn't ask. I just followed him deeper into unfamiliar territory. I should have noticed that he stopped asking about my health and started asking about my assets. I should have heard the difference between a son who cares if you live and one who needs to know what happens when you die. But I heard what I wanted to hear. Concern, interest, the voice of a boy I'd taught to tie his shoes and read maps and understand that family meant something permanent. 2 hours in my legs burned. The fog had lifted slightly, and I could see we were climbing toward a ridge I'd never approached from this angle. Henrik moved with purpose, checking landmarks I didn't recognize, following a route he'd clearly studied. "Almost there," he said. "There's a view I want you to see." The trail opened onto a cliff outcrop at 8:45 a.m. No guardrails, no warning signs, just granite and air and a drop so steep my stomach tightened when I looked down. I could see the valley from here spread out like a map drawn by someone who understood scale. The fog had burned off. The autumn colors looked almost unreal in the morning light. Reds and golds and oranges that seemed too vibrant to be natural. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Henrik said behind me. "It is," I said. "Then Dad, come look at this. You can see the whole valley from right here." He pointed to a spot closer to the edge. I stepped forward. That was the last decision I would make as a father who still believed his son loved him. The hands came at 8:47 a.m. I know because I'd checked my watch 2 minutes earlier, calculating how long the hike back would take, wondering if we'd have time to stop for breakfast at the diner Henrik used to love as a kid. 2 hands, placed precisely between my shoulder blades. Not a shove, not a panicked grab. A controlled mechanical push executed with the kind of deliberate force you use when you need something to move and stay moved. I didn't have time to turn around. I barely had time to understand what was happening before the ground disappeared beneath my boots and the air swallowed me whole. I spent 38 years as a maintenance technician, understanding how machines fail under stress. I never learned how a family breaks when the load becomes too heavy, and the weakest point is love itself. I never studied the mechanics of betrayal, never diagrammed the precise angle and force required for a son to murder his father. But I understood it now, falling through October air, with the wind screaming past my ears. I twisted as I felt some animal instinct making me look back up. Henrik stood at the edge, perfectly still, not reaching out, not screaming my name, not scrambling for help or staring in horror at what his hands had done. Just watching, waiting. His face was calm, patient, like a man waiting for a machine to finish its cycle, for a process to complete, for gravity to do what gravity does. Waiting to hear the sound of impact. The wind tore the breath from my lungs. The earth surged upward like a sentence already passed. And in that impossible moment between the push and the impact, suspended in gravity's absolute judgment, I understood with crystal clarity this was planned. This was always planned. The phone call, the reconciliation, the new trail with no witnesses and no cell service, the questions about assets and trusts and wills. Every word, every gesture, every careful step that led me to this cliff edge where my son could stand behind me and push. 3 seconds of falling felt like 30 years of blindness coming into focus all at once. But falling and dying are not the same thing. The tree didn't save me. It just interrupted my death long enough for me to hear my son confirm he'd planned it. I hit the branch 10 meters down at 40 miles per hour. My collarbone snapped. I heard it crack before I felt it, a wet pop that registered as wrong before the pain arrived. Then the pain arrived. The branch didn't stop me. It changed the angle, tumbling me sideways down the slope. I crashed through brush, slammed into roots, rolled over granite that tore through my jacket. My phone flew from my pocket. My body tucked and rolled while gravity dragged me down another 20 meters. I stopped in a dirt hollow wedged between two boulders. The world tilted wrong. Blood filled my mouth. I'd bitten through my tongue. The taste was copper and salt and bitter coffee residue. I couldn't move. The collarbone ground against something vital every time I breathed. My left leg bent wrong. My shoulder blade might have been broken or just bruised past mattering. Pain mapped my body in regions I didn't know existed. Then I heard Henrik's voice from above, not calling my name, not screaming for help, just talking calm and clear, reporting a completed task. "I'm looking right at the ravine," he said. "No one survives that fall. It's done." He was on his phone. I could hear the tinny quality of speaker mode. Then the volume increased. "Sabine Prescott, 35. My daughter-in-law of 6 years, whose voice, crackling through Henrik's phone speaker from wherever she was waiting, was cold satisfied and utterly unsurprised that her husband had just murdered his father. "Finally," she said, "the house will be ours. Get out of there before anyone sees you." "No one's up here," Henrik said. "I made sure of that. That's why I chose this trail." "So good. Drive straight home. Normal speed. Stop for gas if you need to. Make it look routine. I'll handle the rest." I stopped breathing. Not from pain, from understanding. This wasn't rage or impulse. This wasn't a son who snapped under pressure. This was a plan. They had discussed this, prepared for it, chosen the trail, timed the push, divided responsibilities. She would handle the rest while he drove home at normal speed and established an alibi. "The house will be ours." My son was not calling for help. He was confirming the kill. Those are different things. One means you failed. One means you succeeded. Henrik was reporting success. I lay in the dirt with my collarbone grinding against my lung and understood that the son I'd raised had died years ago without telling me. The man wearing his face had just pushed me off a cliff for real estate. I played dead. It wasn't difficult. Most of me felt dead already. The phone call ended. Silence settled over the ravine like a blanket smelling of crushed leaves and blood. I could hear the creek far below water moving over rocks, the way it had for 10,000 years, indifferent to whether I lived or died. Then I heard rocks shift above. Footsteps, closer to the cliff edge. I couldn't see much from the hollow. Boulders blocked most of my view, and turning my head sent lightning through my spine. But through gaps in the tree canopy, I could see movement. A shadow. Henrik's silhouette against the morning sky. He was leaning forward, peering down, looking for me. My breath stopped. If he decided to climb down, if he wanted to check the body, I was defenseless. I couldn't run, fight, or crawl. The shadow moved closer to the edge. Stayed there. I watched through the leaves and prayed he couldn't see me 30 meters below. 10 seconds. 20. 30. That hesitation hurt worse than the push. Because it meant he knew. He knew I might be breathing down here. And he was deciding, right there on the cliff edge with morning sun warming his back, whether it was worth climbing down to finish the job. How long does it take for a heart to break? not the muscle that kept beating despite the collarbone grinding against my lung, but the part that believed I was loved by the person I loved most. That part broke in the time it took Henrik to make his calculation. The shadow straightened, turned, walked away. I heard his boots crunch gravel, heard the sound fade as he moved back toward the trail, heard the forest absorb him until there was nothing left but wind and birds and the distant creek. He didn't call 911, didn't scramble down to check, didn't show any sign that his father's possible survival troubled him. He just left me bleeding in a dirt hollow with a broken collarbone and shattered understanding of family. Left me to die slowly from exposure or internal bleeding or shock. Left me with the knowledge that he'd looked down, considered I might be alive, and decided it was easier to let the mountain finish what his hands started. The footsteps faded to nothing. The forest resumed its rhythm. Birds whined the creek far below. Henrik left me for dead among the leaves and rocks and 40 years of wasted faith. But I wasn't dead. I was something far more dangerous, a father who finally understood what his son was. And that understanding was the only thing keeping me conscious. I had until nightfall to reach shelter, or the mountain would finish what my son started. Moving hurt less than staying still, and staying still meant dying where my son left me. I refused to give him that satisfaction. The crawl started at 1 p.m., when the sun was high enough to warm the dirt hollow, where I'd spent 3 hours deciding whether survival was worth the cost. The collarbone ground against something vital with every movement sending lightning down my left side. But I'd spent 40 years as a maintenance technician. I understood how to work through pain. You compartmentalize. You focus on the next bolt, the next joint, the next task. The barn was 2 miles north through forest I'd owned for 25 years. I knew every trail, every shortcut, every deer path worn into the slope. The main trail would be faster, but Henrik might return to check his work. I chose the old route through dense brush, the one my father had shown me when I was Henrik's age. I crawled, not on hands and knees. The collarbone made that impossible. On my right side, dragging my body like cargo using tree roots as anchors. Pull 6 feet, rest, pull 6 feet, rest. My left arm hung useless, the shoulder swollen to twice its normal size. 100 meters to the oak. Rest 30 seconds. Next 100 to the hickory. Don't think about distance. Think about the next tree. The technical mindset saved me. I treated my body like a machine with a broken part. Diagnose the failure. Work around it. Keep the system running until you reach the shop. I'd rebuilt 500 horsepower engines with bare hands in freezing warehouses. This was just another machine that needed to stay functional long enough to finish the job. I'd spent 40 years fixing broken machines. I understood how things failed. Metal fatigue, stress fractures, cascade collapses when one part's failure triggered the next. What I never understood was how families break the same way, one small crack spreading until the whole structure comes apart, and you don't notice until it's too late to repair. 4 hours to cover terrain that used to take 30 minutes. The sun dropped toward the horizon. October temperatures would hit freezing after dark. My jacket was torn, my body leaking heat I couldn't afford to lose. When the barn roof appeared through branches at 5 p.m., I understood why I'd built this place after Minerva died. Not for grief. For survival I didn't know I'd need. The hidden cellar entrance was exactly where I'd left it, concealed under deadfall and leaves near the north wall. Only I knew it existed. I'd built it myself 4 years ago, working alone through autumn nights when the house felt too empty, and my hands needed something to do besides remember. Inside, diesel generator, CB radio, 6-monitor, analog camera system, mechanical, safe medical supplies from the 1990s, when I'd worked industrial sites that kept first aid stations stocked for emergencies OSHA never imagined. I needed to splint the collarbone before shock or infection claimed me. Found wood scraps, torn strips from my jacket, my belt. The pain when I pulled the shoulder back into alignment made the world tilt sideways. I passed out. Woke in darkness, finished the job, passed out again. Woke and checked my work. The splint would hold. At 7 p.m., I powered up the generator. The diesel engine coughed once and caught settling into the low rumble that meant fuel was good and compression was holding. Equipment hummed to life. Transformers, relays, the smell of warming electronics. 6 monitors flickered on grainy black and white feeds from cameras I'd positioned across the property. Land camera, driveway camera, front door, kitchen window, back porch, bedroom window, all analog, all hardwired, all showing the same thing: lights on in my house. The cameras showed lights on in my bedroom. My bedroom. Henrik wasn't searching for me. He was already dividing what I owned like I'd been dead for years. I sat in the barn's dim light, watching 6 rectangles of grainy surveillance footage, and understood that the isolated barn I'd built as a grief project had inadvertently created the perfect surveillance base and survival shelter. I watched through the night. Henrik moved through my house like he owned it, because in his mind, he did. In his mind, I was dead in a ravine, and ownership had already transferred. Day 27 a.m., less than 24 hours since I'd gone missing. The monitors showed Henrik and Sabine packing my belongings into cardboard boxes. Not searching, not grieving. Packing. The CB radio hummed with interference. I'd wired it to pick up the landline frequency. Old technician's trick from when we needed to monitor plant communications without being on the official channels. Henrik's voice came through tinny but clear. "Need to file missing person report by 5 p.m., he said to someone. "Lawyer says after 48 hours we can start probate. Just have to look devastated." Pause. Someone responding on the other end. "Yeah, I know. I'll handle it." The kitchen camera caught Sabine entering the frame. She held a digital camera, the kind real estate agents use for listings. She walked through my house methodically, photographing every room, every corner, every piece of furniture. She said something to Henrik I couldn't make out. He laughed. She raised the camera again and snapped a photo of the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast 30 years running. Then she moved to the bedroom. The monitor showed her stepping through the doorway of the room where Minerva had died 4 years ago. Where we'd slept for 35 years. Where I'd held my wife's hand through her last night and promised I'd take care of our son. Sabine raised the camera. Click. Corner angle. Click. Closet door. Click. Window with morning light. Click. Dresser with Minerva's jewelry box still sitting where she'd left it. Not documenting memories, documenting inventory. "Make sure you cry when the sheriff comes," Sabine said, her voice caught by the bedroom microphone. "Real tears if possible. Practice in the mirror if you have to." Through the grainy black and white monitor, I watched my daughter-in-law photograph every corner of the bedroom where my wife died 4 years ago. She wasn't documenting memories. She was documenting inventory, asset by asset, room by room. And I understood with absolute clarity, this wasn't about my death. This was about how fast they could convert my life into cash. I needed to know what else they were planning, and the cameras would show me everything. The 6-camera system could see everything happening in my house and on my land. But the analog DVR could only remember 72 hours of it before the loop erased itself and started over. I discovered this at 8 a.m. on day 2, sitting in the barn's dim light with my splinted collarbone throbbing in rhythm with my pulse. The monitors showed Henrik walking through my kitchen with coffee he'd brewed in my pot. Sabine was on the phone in the living room. The cameras captured it all in grainy black and white, feeding the footage to magnetic tape drives that spun continuously in the metal cabinet beside me. Magnetic tape. 1990s security technology. I'd salvaged the system from a factory demolition 15 years ago, installed it here when I built the barn. At the time, it seemed like free insurance against trespassers or wildlife damage. Now it was the only witness besides me. I opened the DVR cabinet and checked the tape counter. Each reel held 12 hours of 6-camera footage before switching to the next reel. 6 reels total. 72 hours of memory before the system returned to reel 1 and began recording over whatever was there. 3 days, 72 hours to capture evidence or lose everything to the automatic overwrite. I calculated in my head the way I'd calculated machine tolerances and maintenance schedules for 38 years. If Henrik and Sabine spent the next week inside my house preparing their story, plotting their next moves, I'd only have footage of the most recent 3 days. Everything before that would be erased, recorded over, gone. Unless I changed the system parameters, I'd kept dying factory equipment running for decades past its expected lifespan. This surveillance system was the same, obsolete, limited, but if handled right, just capable enough to do the one job I needed. Motion-triggered recording. Old security trick from factory days. Instead of recording continuously, the cameras only captured when movement registered in the frame. Cut storage use by 60%, sometimes more. Focused the memory on moments that actually mattered, rather than hours of empty rooms. I flipped the switches, reset the timers. The tape reels slowed, then stopped. The system waited. On the monitors, Henrik moved through the kitchen, and the reels spun briefly to capture it. He left the frame. The reels stopped. It wasn't luck. It was math. Every machine has limits. Every technician learns to work within them or work around them. I just bought myself a week of storage, maybe 2, if Henrik and Sabine kept moving in and out of frame efficiently. The kitchen monitor showed Sabine returning. She set papers on the table, detailed documents I couldn't quite read from the camera angle. Henrik joined her. They talked, gesturing at the papers. The reels spun, recording. I watched and waited. At 2 p.m., I heard footsteps outside the barn. Not the soft sound of leaves underfoot, but deliberate boot steps on gravel. Someone walking the perimeter. Coming closer. I killed the monitors. The screens went dark. The barn interior fell into dimness, lit only by the crack of afternoon light leaking through the weathered door, where the wood had warped over 20 years of Tennessee weather. The footsteps stopped directly outside. I pressed against the wall, my broken collarbone shrieking with each shallow breath. I forced myself to keep silent. The splint dug into my ribs. Sweat ran cold down my spine despite the October chill. Through the crack in the door, I saw a shadow. A pause. Then a face. Harlan Frost, 72. The retired farmer who'd lived on the adjacent property for 20 years, checking his fence lines and tree stands the same way he had every afternoon since before I bought this mountain land. He stared at the barn door, at the thin line of generator light visible through the gap. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Harlan's face creased in thought. He looked like he was deciding something, weighing options I couldn't see. His hand rose toward the door handle. Then he dropped it. "Lights on in Warren's old barn," he murmured to himself, voice just loud enough to carry through the gap. He paused a moment too long, like the explanation didn't quite satisfy him. "Terrible shame about that fall up on the ridge," he added. He shook his head slowly, turned, walked away. The footsteps faded down the trail toward his property. I stayed frozen against the wall for another 5 minutes, listening to my heart pound against the splinted collarbone, feeling the barn's silence press in from all sides. Harlan Frost. I'd known him 20 years. Helped him fix his tractor 3 times when the hydraulics failed. He'd brought Minerva homemade apple butter every Christmas. He'd sat in my kitchen and told stories about farming this ridge before I'd ever heard of Tennessee. He'd help me if I asked. I believed that. But if Henrik learned I was alive, before I had ironclad evidence, before I had documentation that would hold up in court and lock them away before they could finish the job, I'd be signing my own death warrant a second time. I wanted to call out, tell him, "Harlan, it's me, I'm alive, I need help." But trust is a luxury the dead cannot afford, and I was legally dead the moment Henrik said I was. The whole town thought I was at the bottom of that ravine. Even a 20-year friendship couldn't survive against the weight of assumed death and the risk of premature exposure. He'd looked straight at the crack in the door, straight at where I was standing, pressed against the wall without knowing I was there. Sometimes hiding is easiest when people believe you're already dead. I waited until Harlan's footsteps had been gone for 10 minutes. Then I powered the monitors back on. The reels spun. The screens flickered to life. Henrik and Sabine were still in my kitchen, still talking over the papers spread across the table. Still planning? Still assuming I was dead and their plan was working perfectly. Harlan's footsteps faded down the trail toward his property. He'd seen the light registered something unusual and walked away without pressing the question. The whole town thought I was at the bottom of that ravine. My oldest neighbor had looked straight at where I stood, and chosen for reasons of his own not to look closer. That invisibility was my greatest weapon and my deepest curse. But the cameras didn't care if I was dead or alive. They just kept recording. Day 3. The kitchen camera caught my daughter-in-law spreading detailed property maps across my table. Maps she'd drawn in her own handwriting 6 months before my son pushed me off the cliff. The cameras kept recording through the night after Harlan left. I watched the monitors in shifts, sleeping in 30-minute intervals between the pain that woke me when the collarbone shifted against the splint. Day 3, evening 7 p.m., the kitchen camera showed movement. Sabine entered the frame carrying rolled papers under her arm. She cleared my kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten breakfast 30 years running, and spread the papers flat, weighing the corners with coffee mugs that had been mine and Minerva's. Even through the grainy black and white feed, I could see the detail. Handwritten maps, precise lines and annotations covering every sheet. She smoothed them carefully, running her palm across the paper to flatten the curl. Henrik entered the frame behind her. Stopped. Stared. What are those?" His voice came through the audio feed, tinny but clear. Sabine didn't look up. "Property documentation. We need to start the liquidation process soon. Who drew all these maps? When did we start planning this?" She looked at him then. Her face was calm, matter-of-fact, showing the same expression I'd seen her use when discussing furniture prices at the store where she worked as manager. I drew them 6 months ago, Henrik. I've been preparing for this since before you even knew your debts were a death sentence. 6 months. I zoomed the camera as far as the analog system would allow. The maps came into slightly sharper focus. House floor plan with furniture values written in margins. Mountain land survey with acreage calculations and comparable sales prices. Bank routing numbers. Portfolio breakdown with account balances. She'd mapped my entire life like a territory to be conquered. Henrik was silent on the monitor, just standing there looking at the papers spread across my table. Looking at evidence that his wife had been planning my death half a year before October, half a year before that phone call that started with, "Dad, I want us to have a day just for the two of us." She didn't manipulate my son into murder. She designed the murder first, then spent 6 months turning him into someone who could execute it. The CB radio crackled. I'd left it scanning frequencies, picking up the landline. Sabine's voice came through. She'd moved to the phone in the living room. "I'm calling about the mountain property in East Tennessee," she said. 640 acres. Looking for comparable sales in the area and timeline estimates for quick liquidation. Yes, I can hold. Quick liquidation. My father had owned that land. I'd inherited it 30 years ago. I'd paid taxes on it every year even when money was tight, because some things you don't sell. Some things you keep. She was already pricing it like inventory. I watched through the night. Took notes on what the cameras captured, what the CB intercepted. Built a timeline of their planning, their movements, their words. Evidence. Documentation. The kind of records that would matter in court. Day 4:09 a.m. The living room camera showed Henrik sitting on the couch, motionless, staring at nothing. Sabine entered the frame, pacing. What happened next wasn't an argument. I'd seen arguments. This was something different. "You can't do anything without me, Henrik." Her voice was sharp, controlled. "You'd still be hiding from loan sharks if I hadn't planned every step of this." Henrik didn't respond, didn't defend himself. Just sat there with shoulders slumped. "You were too weak to act until I made it simple for you. I drew the maps. I chose the trail. I told you exactly when to push. You couldn't even do that without me walking you through it like a child." I know," Henrik said, barely audible through the audio feed. "You're right. I wouldn't have been able to do it without you." She stopped pacing, looked at him with an expression I couldn't quite read through the grainy feed. Not quite contempt. Not quite satisfaction. Something colder. "Don't forget that," she said. "Don't forget who made this possible. I'd seen this pattern before. Not in marriage, in factory safety films about workplace coercion and psychological conditioning. The systematic breakdown of autonomy. The controller who makes commands indistinguishable from the subject's own thoughts. She wasn't his wife or partner. She was his programmer. And my son, the boy who used to cry over injured birds, had let her rewrite every moral line I'd ever taught him. I wanted to hate him purely, completely, without complication. But watching her systematically erase what remained of his autonomy, I understood he was both killer and killed. That didn't absolve him. It just meant there were two people I needed to destroy. The living room camera captured Henrik nodding again, agreeing with her, accepting her version of reality, where he was weak and she was strong, and the only way forward was through her control. How long had this been happening? The maps were 6 months old, but the conditioning, the breaking down of his resistance, the erosion of boundaries between her commands and his choices, that took longer. A year, too, had he been like this when Minerva died, and I'd been too grief-blind to see. The questions didn't change the facts. Henrik's hands pushed me. Henrik chose to stand at that cliff edge and execute the plan she'd drawn. Henrik decided to walk away without checking if his father was breathing. But Sabine chose to make him capable of choosing it. I watched her condition him, aim him, and fire him at me like a weapon she'd spent half a year loading and cocking. My son was guilty of my murder. His hands, his push, his choice. But she was guilty of making him capable of choosing it. The moral distinction mattered in some abstract philosophical way. It mattered not at all to my broken collarbone, my shattered ribs, or the 35 meters I fell. But the cameras were recording every manipulation, every confession, every self-incriminating word. Day 4 afternoon. Sheriff Vernon Hughes pulled into my driveway in his patrol car, and through the front door camera, I watched my son arrange his face into the expression of a bereaved child, one he'd clearly practiced. The cameras kept recording everything, every word Sabine said, every manipulation, every self-incriminating moment. And now they were about to record Henrik's performance for law enforcement. Sheriff Vernon Hughes, 50 years old. Greene County Sheriff with 2 decades on the job, stepped out of the patrol car at 2 p.m. His face was genuinely heavy with sympathy for what he believed was a family destroyed by tragic hiking accident. He walked up to the front door, where Henrik stood waiting. I adjusted the outdoor camera angle from inside the barn. The feed was grainy but clear enough. Clear enough to see Henrik's eyes, red-rimmed but from rubbing, not crying. Clear enough to see Sabine step behind him, placing her hand on his shoulder in the perfect grieving wife tableau. Clear enough to see Henrik take a breath, settle his features, and step into character. "Sheriff," Henrik said, voice already shaking. "Any news? We'll keep search teams deployed another 48 hours, son." The sheriff's tone was gentle. "Terrain up there is brutal, but we're not giving up on your father." Henrik's face crumpled, just the right amount. Not theatrical, not overwrought. Just enough to sell genuine anguish. "Thank you, Sheriff. My dad." His voice cracked. Perfect timing, perfect placement. "He knows those mountains better than anyone. I keep telling myself he found shelter somewhere, and he's just waiting for us to find him." The crack in his voice was manufactured. I heard it. The controlled tremor, the deliberate pause before saying, "Dad," the hope mixed with tragedy in exactly the ratio that would make it believable. He'd rehearsed this, practiced the timing until it felt natural. Sabine squeezed his shoulder. Her face showed concerned support, wifely devotion. "All lies. All performance. We're doing everything we can," Sheriff Hughes said. "These things, sometimes folks turn up after days in the woods. Hypothermia, disorientation. Don't lose hope yet." "I won't," Henrik said. "I can't." The sheriff patted his shoulder and returned to the patrol car. Henrik and Sabine stayed on the porch until the car disappeared down the driveway. Then Henrik's face went blank. The grief vanished, like someone had flipped a switch. He turned and walked inside without a word. I watched from the barn, my broken collarbone throbbing in rhythm with my pulse, and understood he hadn't just lied to the sheriff. He'd delivered a technically proficient performance that required extensive rehearsal. How many times had he practiced that voice crack in the mirror? How many rehearsals before the timing felt natural? The grief sounded real enough to sell to a sheriff with 20 years of reading people's faces. The question answered itself, enough times to get it perfect. Day 5:11 p.m. I couldn't sleep. The collarbone sent lightning through my shoulder every time I shifted position. The barn was cold. My body was failing in small ways. The splint needed adjustment. The bruises had gone from purple to yellow-green. Infection was a constant risk. But my mind was sharp, too sharp, turning over questions I couldn't answer. I pulled up the camera system's oldest archived footage, 6 months back when the first reel started its loop. The DVR had been recording since I installed it 4 years ago, but storage limitations meant anything older than the current cycle was gone. 6 months was enough. I watched Henrik's visits, ordinary conversations that seemed different now that I knew how they ended. 6 months ago, Henrik standing in my kitchen suggesting I sell the mountain land. "Dad, you're 68. That's a lot of property to maintain. Have you thought about liquidating while the market's good?" I'd refused. Said the land was family legacy. He'd nodded, smiled, dropped it. Not concern, reconnaissance. 4 months ago, Henrik pushing for will updates. "You should really get the paperwork current, Dad. Make sure everything's clear. You know, just in case." I'd delayed. Said I'd get to it eventually. He'd pushed gently, then backed off. Not responsibility, intelligence gathering. 2 months ago, dinner with Henrik and Sabine. Sabine asking detailed questions about life insurance. "Does your policy have any unusual clauses? What about accidental death provisions?" I'd dismissed it as morbid curiosity. Changed the subject. Not curiosity, target analysis. They'd asked me to hand them the rope. Sell this update that explained this policy. I'd thought I was being a helpful father. I didn't realize I was tying my own noose while they held the other end. Each question had been a test. Each suggestion had been a probe of my defenses. And when I didn't comply, When I refused to sell the land, delayed updating the will, brushed off the insurance questions, they'd moved to the next phase. Direct action. I sat in the dark barn watching 6 months of archived footage, seeing my son and daughter-in-law circle me like surveyors marking a demolition site. Every concerned question had been a measurement. Every suggestion had been a test. I'd given them 3 chances, 3 distinct opportunities to choose differently. 6 months ago, when I refused to sell the land, they could have accepted it and found another way forward. 4 months ago, when I delayed the will, they could have recognized I was protecting myself and backed away. 2 months ago, when I deflected the insurance questions, they could have seen the warning signs and chosen a different path. They chose murder every single time. That didn't absolve me of blindness. It didn't lighten their guilt 1 ounce. It only deepened my pain. Knowing I'd watched the entire setup unfold and mistook reconnaissance for love surveillance, for family concern, the targeting sequence for normal conversation. And every reconnaissance conversation was captured on camera, time-stamped, dated, preserved. Day 6. The mountain camera caught my son walking back to the cliff alone. And for the first time since he pushed me, I saw something in his hunched shoulders that looked almost like doubt. Every reconnaissance conversation was captured, time-stamped, preserved. And now the cameras were about to show me something I hadn't expected, Henrik beginning to crack. The outdoor camera I'd mounted on a pine tree near the trailhead picked him up at 8 a.m. alone. No Sabine. He walked slowly, stopping every few hundred feet to look around like he was checking for witnesses. When he reached the cliff edge, he stood at the exact spot where he'd positioned me 7 days earlier. He stared down into the ravine. Not casually, not briefly. He stood there for 10 full minutes, hands shoved in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the October wind. Then he did something I didn't expect. He descended. Carefully testing each foothold, he climbed down into the ravine. The camera angle couldn't follow him completely, but I could see his head and shoulders appearing and disappearing between the trees as he searched the slope, looking for the body, looking for any trace, clothing blood evidence that his father had died where gravity should have killed him. He found nothing. I'd erased all the tracks 6 days ago when I crawled to the barn, smoothed the dirt hollow where I'd landed, scattered leaves over the drag marks, covered my survival the way I'd covered maintenance mistakes at the factory, methodically, completely leaving no trace of the failure. Henrik climbed back up. When he appeared at the cliff edge, his face was pale. His hands shook slightly as he brushed dirt off his jeans. He looked down one more time, then turned and walked back toward the house faster than he'd come. 2 hours later, the kitchen camera caught him with Sabine. "Hi, are you absolutely sure?" His voice was uncertain, nothing like the controlled performance he'd given Sheriff Hughes. What if he survived somehow? What if someone finds evidence that... Sabine cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "You're starting to grow weak, Henrik. This is exactly the weakness that will destroy us both. He's dead. Accept it and move forward." But I went back to the site. There's no body, no traces. What if... Stop. She stepped closer to him, and through the grainy feed, I could see her face inches from his. "You did what you had to do. We planned this for months. Don't fall apart now because you can't see proof. Some bodies aren't found for weeks, months, years. The ravine is deep. Animals scatter remains. This is normal." Henrik nodded, but his shoulders stayed slumped. He was doubting. Good. Let that doubt eat him from inside like acid on steel. That was the first punishment, and I hadn't even revealed myself yet. Day 7:03 p.m. The home office camera showed Henrik sitting at my desk, the desk I'd built from reclaimed factory lumber 20 years ago, with my laptop open. He'd found my passwords, probably guessed them, or maybe found them written in one of the notebooks Sabine had been methodically searching. He pulled up my bank account. The main savings account I'd spent 38 years filling with overtime pay and careful budgeting and money I didn't spend on vacations I never took. The screen loaded. His face went from curious to confused to pale in the space of 3 seconds. "Sabine," he called out. His voice cracked, but not in the rehearsed way from the sheriff's performance. This was genuine shock. "Sabine, come here." She appeared in the doorframe. "What? Where is the money?" He turned the laptop toward her. "The main account, $1.2 million. It shows 0. "Where did it go?" Sabine rushed to the desk, leaned over the laptop, stared at the screen. Her perfect composure cracked for the first time since I'd been watching her. That's impossible." Her voice rose, losing the controlled modulation she always maintained. "I verified the balance 2 months ago when I drew the maps. It was there. All of it, every dollar accounted for." Henrik scrolled through the transaction history. Found it. His finger stabbed at the screen. "Transfer to trust. 6 months ago. $1.2 million. He looked up at Sabine. "You said you checked everything." "And I did check. This account was full in August." "Full? Well, it's empty now." They stared at the screen in silence. The laptop's glow lit their faces with cold light that made them look like ghosts arguing over treasure that had never existed. 40 years as maintenance technician taught me always install redundant systems. Backup generators, safety valves, fail-safe mechanisms that activate when primary systems fail. I'd applied that rule to my assets without thinking about it. Moved the money into an irrevocable trust because it seemed like responsible estate planning, because Minerva had told me before she died, "Always have a backup plan, Warren." She'd been right about so many things. In the barn, I smiled for the first time in 7 days. The expression hurt. My face had forgotten how. They'd murdered me for money that became legally unreachable the moment I signed the trust documents. They'd committed patricide for assets they could never access, killed a father to inherit wealth that had already been structured to bypass them completely. They'd planned for 6 months, drew maps, chose trails, calculated timelines, rehearsed performances, pushed me off a cliff, walked away, lied to sheriffs, photographed my bedroom like inventory. For nothing. I watched them discover the $1.2 million they'd murdered me for didn't exist anymore. 6 months ago, I'd transferred it into an irrevocable trust. Not because I suspected them, but because I'd learned in 40 years to always have backup systems for critical infrastructure. They'd killed me for money that was unreachable. They'd committed patricide for nothing. And watching Sabine's perfect composure finally shatter on that grainy black and white monitor was the first moment since the cliff that I felt something other than pain. But the empty account wasn't the only thing I'd prepared without knowing I was preparing for this. I spread the evidence across the workbench. Camera footage, CB recordings, bank statements, and felt the weight of the phone in my pocket. One call to Sheriff Hughes, and this could be over by morning. That's when I realized the most dangerous move I could make was the obvious one. The empty account wasn't the only thing I'd prepared without knowing. The barn had medical supplies. The cameras had motion triggers. The CB radio could intercept their landline. I'd built redundancies into everything without realizing I was building a survival base for the day my son would try to murder me. But all the preparation, all the evidence, all the documentation meant nothing if I deployed it at the wrong moment. I picked up the phone. Sheriff Hughes's number was in my contacts. My thumb hovered over the call button. 8 days of pain and surveillance and watching my son and daughter-in-law dissect my life like scavengers. All of it could end with one call. That's when I understood why it couldn't. If I called now tonight, what would happen? Henrik and Sabine would have their story ready within hours. I'd be the confused old man who'd suffered head trauma in a hiking accident. They'd say I wandered off in shock, that my memories were scrambled, that I was inventing conspiracy theories to explain natural events. Henrik was a real estate broker. He knew how to sell narratives. Sabine had been planning this for 6 months. She'd have contingencies for my survival. They'd claim accident, present evidence I'd slipped, produce witnesses who'd say I'd been forgetful, lately disoriented, showing signs of cognitive decline they'd been worried about for months. Maybe they'd have a doctor ready to testify about my supposed memory issues. Maybe they'd cry and say they'd been trying to help me, but I'd been too proud to accept it. And I'd have what camera footage they'd claim showed normal family interactions. CB recordings they'd say were taken without consent. Bank statements showing my own financial decisions. No witnesses to the push. No third-party verification. Just my word against theirs, and I was the one who'd wandered off for 8 days without calling for help. I set the phone down. 42 years I fixed machines because I understood one thing: you don't force a seized bolt. You wait. You apply penetrating oil. You let physics and chemistry do the work. Rushing destroys threads, strips, heads, turns a repair into a replacement. Patience extracts every bolt intact. They thought I was dead. That was the penetrating oil. Every hour they felt safe was another thread loosening. Every conversation they had, assuming I couldn't hear, was another bolt turning freely. Every plan they made, thinking they'd succeeded, was another piece of the machine I could dismantle when the time came. I'd spent 8 days learning to be patient with pain. Now I needed to be patient with revenge. I reviewed the CB recordings, casual conversations between Henrik and Sabine, planning probate timelines, discussing property liquidation, arguing about the empty account. All of it incriminating if you knew what you were listening for. All of it defensible if you didn't. "We need to file the death certificate soon," Sabine had said 2 days ago. "What if someone questions the timeline?" Henrik had responded. "So no one will. Hiking accidents happen. Old men fall. It's a tragedy, not a mystery. They were careless because they thought they were safe. But careless wasn't the same as stupid. They were careful enough not to explicitly confess on recordable lines. Careful enough to keep their planning vague. Careful enough that nothing I had would be ironclad in court without corroboration. I needed them to incriminate themselves in front of someone who wasn't me. What's the difference between justice and revenge? Justice needs witnesses. Revenge just needs you and the target. I could have revenge right now. Walk into that house, confront them, watch them realize their plan had failed. But I'd spent 38 years as a maintenance technician, not a vigilante. I wanted justice, which meant I needed to wait for the moment when their words and actions would be witnessed by someone who could testify. I needed Henrik to crack publicly, to break down in front of Sheriff Hughes or a lawyer or a neighbor, someone who would remember his confession, document his guilt. Or I needed Sabine to discuss her escape plan with a third party. A real estate agent, a travel agent, someone who could confirm premeditation, verify conspiracy. I had time. The collarbone was healing. The barn had enough supplies for weeks. The cameras had storage for days of motion-triggered recording. I could wait. The hard part wasn't waiting. It was choosing the right moment to stop waiting. I set my conditions. I would remain dead, legally, practically, strategically dead, until one of two things happened. Either Henrik broke in front of a third party, or Sabine discussed her plans with someone I could trace and document. Until then, the CB radio stayed on, the cameras kept recording, and the ghost of Warren Prescott would watch his son and daughter-in-law dig their own grave, one careless word at a time. No premature revelation, no emotional confrontation, no moment of weakness where I gave them the chance to regroup and rebuild their narrative. I would wait until the machine had loosened completely. Then I would take it apart, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, until nothing remained but evidence and consequence. Day 8 ended. The barn was cold. My body ached, but my mind was clear. Day 9 began. I checked the CB radio frequency, scanning through the channels for any transmission from the house. Static. White noise. Then Henrik's voice came through, shaky and uncertain, in a way his rehearsed performances for Sheriff Hughes had never been. "Chatiniota, we need to talk about what happens when the estate closes," he said to someone, probably Sabine based on the intimate tone. "The lawyer keeps asking questions I don't have answers for. Questions about the trust, about asset transfers, about documentation I can't find." A pause. Then Sabine's voice, harder than Henrik's. "We handle it the way we planned. We don't change course now. But the money, we find the money. It's somewhere. He didn't just make it disappear." I listened to them circle their confusion, their growing panic, their inability to locate assets they'd murdered me to obtain. The estate was closing. The pressure was mounting. And I was patient. Patience was the oil. Time was the wrench. And I would wait until every bolt turned freely before I dismantled what they'd built on my presumed death. The mechanical safe required 4 separate rotations and a key I'd kept in my boot for 9 days. And when the door finally swung open, Minerva's handwriting stared back at me from an envelope marked, "For Warren when you need it." Day 9 morning. I'd decided to wait, to be patient, to let time and pressure do the work. But first I needed to know exactly what I had to work with. The safe held the documents I'd need eventually. Property deeds, account records, the legal infrastructure of a life I'd spent 68 years building. I reached for the asset folder. My hand stopped. The envelope sat on top of everything else. Minerva's handwriting, the careful script she'd used for birthday cards and grocery lists and love notes she'd leave in my lunchbox when I worked factory shifts. The paper was aged, yellowed at the edges. The envelope was sealed but not taped, the kind of closure that said, "Open this when you're ready, not before." I wasn't ready. I opened it anyway. The letter was dated 4 years ago, 3 months before she died. Before the cancer had eaten away everything except her mind, which stayed sharp until the last week when the morphine finally took that too. My love, it began. I'm writing this while I still can, while my hand still works, and my thoughts still connect. There are things I need to say that I can't say while I'm alive, and you're listening with that expression you get when you're trying to fix something that can't be fixed. I sat down on the barn floor. The collarbone sent its familiar lightning bolt, but I barely felt it. I worry about Henrik. The letter continued. Not because he is bad, but because I see him becoming someone he doesn't want to be. I see her changing him day by day. Sabine is smart and beautiful, and completely without the boundaries that held us together all these years. She wants things, Warren. Not normal things. Not love or family or the life we built. She wants more, always more, and I watch our son slowly accepting that wanting more is the only thing that matters. My hands shook. The paper rattled. I don't think she loves him. I think she loves what he can access, and I watch him pretend not to notice because he's so desperate to be loved by someone that confident, that certain, that alive. The words blurred. I blinked and tears fell onto paper that had been waiting 4 years for me to read it. Please be careful. Don't give too much to the point where you forget to care for yourself. I won't be there to remind you. But I need you to hear this. You are allowed to protect yourself even from family. Especially from family. Love doesn't require you to be destroyed by it. She'd signed it, "Forever yours, Minerva." I sat on the cold barn floor, holding a letter from my dead wife, and cried for the first time since Henrik pushed me off the cliff. Not for the broken collarbone or the 8 days of pain or the surveillance footage of my son planning my murder. I cried because Minerva had known. 4 years ago, dying in that hospital bed, while I held her hand and promised everything would be okay, she'd already seen what I refused to see. Grief has a half-life. It doesn't disappear. It just transforms into something you carry differently, something that can coexist with rage and calculation and the cold mechanics of revenge. I'd been carrying Minerva's absence for 4 years. Now I carried her warning to validation that arrived too late to prevent anything but early enough to explain everything. I folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, set it aside. Beneath it was another envelope, this one addressed to me in my own handwriting. Postmarked 3 years ago. Return address, this barn. I opened it. Notarized photocopies of every asset document I owned. The house deed. The mountain land survey. Bank account statements. Investment portfolio summary. And a will. Not the will Henrik knew about, the one I'd shown him 4 years ago when he asked about estate planning. This was different. This will establish an irrevocable trust. Everything I owned transferred into legal structure that couldn't be dissolved, couldn't be contested, couldn't be accessed through normal probate. The trust had specific conditions for distribution. Death alone didn't trigger transfer. There were other requirements: verification procedures, waiting periods, trustee approvals. The trust documents were filed with Graham and Associates in Knoxville, a law firm I'd used once for factory contract review 15 years ago. A firm Henrik had never heard of. I mailed this to myself 3 years ago, before Sabine drew her maps, before Henrik decided murder was easier than working. I mailed it because 38 years maintaining equipment taught me always keep a backup copy in a location you control. Was it preparation, or was it instinct? I asked myself, staring at the self-mailed envelope with its 3-year-old postmark. Do mechanics secure backups because they plan for betrayal, or because 40 years of fixing broken systems teaches you that everything eventually fails? I didn't know. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was this: Henrik and Sabine were fighting over $2.05 million in assets they legally could not touch. The will Henrik thought he was inheriting under superseded 3 years ago by trust documents he didn't know existed. The money Sabine had verified in bank accounts transferred into trust protection long before she drew her first reconnaissance map. They'd planned 6 months. They'd murdered me for an inheritance structured specifically to prevent exactly what they were trying to do. I replaced the documents in the safe, locked it with 4 rotations, and the key that had lived in my boot through 9 days of survival. My hands didn't shake anymore. The CB radio crackled to life. Sabine's voice came through tight, with controlled fury. I'd never heard from her before. The estate lawyer called, she said to Henrik wherever he was in my house. There's a problem with the probate timeline. Something about trust structures and verification requirements. He's asking for documents we don't have. Pause. What kind of documents? Henrik's voice worried. Haramaitsa, documents your father apparently filed 3 years ago that supersede everything we found in his desk. I listened as their plan began to unravel from the legal side. I spent day 10 scrolling through 2 years of archived footage hunting for the exact moment my son stopped being my son, and found it at timestamp 14/22/07 on November 3, 2021. 3 days after we buried Minerva. Their plan continued unraveling from the legal side. The CB picked up fragments of frustrated phone calls with estate lawyers, probate specialists, trust administrators. But while they scrambled to understand the legal walls I'd built 3 years ago, I needed to understand when the moral walls had come down. The camera system had been recording since I installed it. 2 years of footage compressed and stored in overlapping cycles. I pulled up the oldest reliable archives and started scanning. Henrik's visits, dozens of them. Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, random weekday stops when he claimed to be checking in on Dad. I watched them all at double speed, looking for the moment everything changed. November 3rd, 2021. The timestamp read 14/22/07. Minerva had died on October 31st. Halloween. The funeral was November 1st. This footage was captured 3 days later. Henrik entered my house using the key I'd given him years ago. He walked through the living room without stopping, climbed the stairs to the second floor, entered the master bedroom where Minerva and I had slept for 35 years. I watched him walk through that room like a real estate agent staging a property. His mother was 3 days buried, and he was already calculating square footage. He opened the closet, checked the window view, ran his hand along the dresser Minerva had inherited from her grandmother. The look on his face wasn't grief. It was appraisal. He stood there for 7 minutes, just standing, looking, measuring. Then Sabine entered the frame. She must have been waiting downstairs. She walked to him, put her hand on his shoulder, and said something the audio didn't quite catch. But I saw his face change, saw him nod, saw her gesture around the room like she was describing possibilities. They left together 10 minutes later. The house empty. My wife's bedroom converted in Henrik's mind from sacred space to inventory. Minerva knew. That's what her letter meant. She was the dam holding him back, and the moment she died, everything she'd kept contained just flooded. Not gradually, not over years of corruption. Instantly, 3 days. My son didn't become someone else. He became who he always was once the person who made him pretend was gone. I thought about sons, about raising them, about teaching them to read and drive and understand that family meant something permanent. I'd built Henrik the same way I'd built machines, carefully, methodically hoping the design was sound and the parts would hold. But sometimes the defect is in the design from the start. Sometimes you build something hoping it'll run clean, but the flaw was there before you ever turned the key. And the only thing keeping it from breaking was the mechanic who knew exactly where to apply pressure to hold the broken parts together. Minerva had been that pressure. I'd been too blind to see it. Day 11 morning. The office camera showed Sabine alone. Henrik had left for something. A meeting with the estate lawyer maybe, or another conversation with Sheriff Hughes about the search that had officially ended 2 days ago. Sabine sat at my computer, opened Henrik's laptop that he'd left on the desk, entered passwords she shouldn't have known, pulled up his bank account, the one he'd opened as a real estate broker to handle commission payments and deal closings. She opened a transfer window, typed numbers, clicked submit. $500 from Henrik's account to another account whose number I couldn't see on camera. Not enough to trigger alerts, just enough to slowly drain. I watched her do it 3 more times. 500, 800, 300. Amounts small enough Henrik wouldn't notice in accounts where tens of thousands moved regularly. Large enough to matter when you did it every week for months. She'd been building an exit fund. Then she opened a browser, cleared the history first, careful. Searched for flights to Cancun. She scrolled through options, selected one, December 20th, 5 days before Christmas. 1 passenger, one-way ticket. She entered payment information. Not Henrik's card, not a joint account. Her own private card connected to the account she'd been filling with Henrik's money. The confirmation screen appeared. She screenshot it, emailed it to herself, deleted the email from the sent folder, closed the browser, cleared the history again. December 20th. She'd be gone before the estate closed, before Henrik realized the inheritance was legally untouchable, before he understood she'd been preparing to abandon him since before they pushed me. What do you call the emotion when you watch your son's betrayer prepare to betray him? Is it justice, or is it just another layer of tragedy, knowing that even his villainy won't be rewarded, that he killed his father for a woman who was already planning her exit? I didn't know. I sat in the barn, watching the footage loop, watching Sabine book her escape, and felt something complicated that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite pity. My son tried to kill me for money he'd never inherit. The woman he did it for was about to leave him holding an empty bag and a murder charge. The partnership he trusted completely was her solo exit strategy, and every day he believed in her was another day she converted his accounts into her freedom. I froze the footage on Sabine's screen. The Cancun flight confirmation glowed in the grainy black and white feed. December 20th. One-way ticket, gate assignment, seat number. Every detail of her planned abandonment captured in pixels. Henrik had no idea. He thought they were partners, thought she loved him, thought they'd split the inheritance and live the luxury life she'd promised when she drew those maps 6 months ago. He thought wrong. I knew something Henrik didn't. He was about to lose everything. The money that never existed. The woman who never loved him. The freedom he threw away the moment he pushed his father off that cliff. And watching it all unravel was the coldest satisfaction I'd felt since the cameras started recording. But I had a choice to make. Let Henrik discover Sabine's betrayal on his own, or weaponize the information. I opened the ledger I'd kept for 40 years, every major expense logged in mechanics shorthand, and started adding up every dollar I'd given my son hunting for the exact price I'd paid for 10 years of acting. I'd made my choice about Sabine's flight. I wouldn't tell Henrik. Let him discover it on his own or not discover it at all. Let their partnership fracture naturally under the weight of lies they'd built together. My role was to watch, document, and wait. But first I needed to understand the full cost. The ledger went back decades. Minerva had laughed at me for keeping it. Warren, you don't need to write down every oil change. But 40 years in maintenance taught me document everything because memory fails, but records don't. I found Henrik's first entry, 10 years ago. November 2014. First debt, $120,000. Gambling losses he swore would never happen again. He'd come to me crying, genuinely terrified. Said loan sharks were threatening him. Said he'd made a terrible mistake and learned his lesson. He hugged me when I wrote the check. Said, "I love you, Dad," like he meant it. I flipped forward. 2 years later, $35,000. Failed investment he called bad luck. Market timing, he said. Just needed bridge capital to cover margin calls. Same hug. Same words. I love you, Dad. Car repairs I didn't charge him for. $4,200 in parts and labor spread across 6 years. Loans with vague purposes. Cash flow problem. Temporary bridge. Just until commission clears. 12,000, 8,000, 23,000. Envelopes of cash I handed over because he was my son and you help your son. I added it up, cross-checked the dates, verified the amounts. $280,000 across 10 years. $28,000 per year. A decent actor's salary. I sat in the barn with the ledger open and understood Henrik hadn't gradually turned into someone who could murder me. He'd been performing the role of loving son for a decade, and I'd been paying him for the performance without knowing I'd bought tickets. He was the lead actor. Sabine eventually became the director. And I was the audience member who thought I was watching a documentary when it was always fiction. Every "I love you, Dad" had been a line. Every hug had been blocking. Every moment I'd treasured had been rehearsed. The terrible thing wasn't that he'd faked it. The terrible thing was how good he was at it. Good enough that I never once checked to see if the theater was empty, if the emotions were real, if the son I was watching actually existed, or was just a role someone played when they needed money. I closed the ledger, filed it back in the safe next to Minerva's letter, and the self-mailed envelope. Evidence of everything I'd given, everything I'd believed, everything that had been a lie. Before I tell you what Henrik did at 2 a.m. when he thought no one was watching, comment whether you think guilt can exist in someone who faked love for money. Tell me why in 5 to 10 words. Quick note, this next part includes recreated details for emotional impact. Day 13, 2 a.m. The living room camera showed movement. Henrik entered the frame alone. No lights, just the faint glow from the street lamp outside filtering through curtains I'd hung 20 years ago. He sat on the couch in darkness. He held his phone, stared at it for 3 full minutes, then dialed. I knew the number. It was mine. The phone I'd lost when I fell still somewhere on that mountain or at the bottom of the ravine. Still connected to my account, still ringing into void. The phone rang 6 times. Then my voice. "You've reached Warren Prescott. Leave a message." Henrik didn't hang up, didn't leave a message. Just held the phone to his ear, listening to his dead father's voicemail greeting play through and disconnect. He set the phone down, sat in the dark. 47 minutes. I watched the timestamp crawl forward while Henrik sat motionless on my couch, in my house in darkness, so complete, I could barely see his outline. He didn't turn on lights, didn't call Sabine, didn't move except to breathe. Just sat with what he'd done alone, the way I'd sat at the bottom of that ravine with a broken collarbone and the understanding that my son had tried to kill me. I understood the unique pain of fathers who pay for love they thought was freely given. You don't mourn the money. You mourn the years you believed the performance. You mourn the moments you treasured that were always just blocking and rehearsed lines. You mourn the son you thought you raised, not realizing you were funding an actor who studied you well enough to know exactly which strings to pull. This was the last time Henrik would call me as a son. Next time, if there was a next time, he'd be calling as a defendant, and I'd be the witness who buried him. The relationship had ended at 8:47 a.m. on that cliff edge. This was just Henrik finally understanding what I'd known for 13 days. He picked up the phone again, dialed, my voicemail greeting, set it down, stared into darkness. At 2:47 a.m., he stood, walked upstairs. The bedroom camera showed him lie down, fully clothed on top of the covers. He didn't sleep, just stared at the ceiling until dawn. I watched it all from the barn, felt no satisfaction, no anger, just cold recognition that my son was cracking under the weight of what he'd done. The question wasn't whether Henrik would break. The question was whether he'd break publicly in front of witnesses the way I needed him to, or whether he'd break privately in darkness where it wouldn't serve justice. I could accelerate his collapse, show him evidence of Sabine's flight, reveal that the money didn't exist, push him toward the breaking point. Or I could wait, let pressure build naturally, let him fracture on his own timeline. Patience had kept me alive this long. Patience had given me documentation, evidence proof. But patience also meant risk. Risk that Henrik would break in private, risk that the confession I needed would happen where no one else could hear it. I watched the sun rise on day 13. Henrik hadn't moved from the bedroom. The cameras kept recording, and I still didn't know whether to wait for him to break or whether to be the one who finally pushed him over the edge. The camera caught Henrik holding the credit card statement with hands that shook, staring at line items shipping to an address in Knoxville he'd never heard of, and I watched the exact moment he realized his partner was preparing an exit he wasn't invited to. I'd decided to wait, to let Henrik break on his own timeline to see if patience would deliver the public confession I needed. But nature made the decision for me. Day 14, the kitchen camera captured what patience alone never could have produced. Henrik stood at the counter, sorting through mail I'd been too dead to receive. bills, advertisements, credit card statements addressed to Sabine. He opened one, probably looking for more bad news about money, more proof that everything they'd planned was collapsing. His face went from curious to confused to pale in the space of 3 seconds. The statement showed purchases, multiple shipments, all going to an address in Knoxville, storage unit rental, moving supplies, furniture delivery scheduled for December. Sabine walked into frame. "What are you reading?" Henrik didn't answer immediately, just held up the statement. "Where are you shipping this address in Knoxville? I've never heard of it. We haven't even gotten the money yet and you're already spending—" She snatched the paper from his hand. "None of your business. None of my—" His voice rose. "We're partners. We planned this together. What the hell are you doing with a storage unit in Knoxville? While managing contingencies you're too weak to think about." "Contingencies or an exit strategy?" She didn't answer. Just stood there holding the statement with an expression I'd seen before, the cold calculation she used when explaining furniture prices to difficult customers. Henrik stepped closer. "You're leaving. Aren't you? That December 20th flight I saw in your browser history before you deleted it. That's real. You're actually planning to leave. What do you think you can do without me?" Her voice was sharp as broken glass. "Go turn yourself in. Tell them how you pushed your father off a cliff. You think you can survive what we did without me managing every detail." I stopped breathing. She said it. Camera rolling, audio clear, explicit acknowledgement. Tell them how you pushed your father off a cliff. She just handed me everything I needed wrapped in her own fury. Henrik backed away from her. "I did that for us. For our future. You said it was the only way. And it was. But that doesn't mean I owe you anything beyond what we agreed to. We agreed to be partners. We agreed to get the money. Money that apparently doesn't exist anymore thanks to your father's trust structures we knew nothing about. So yes, I'm preparing alternatives. Because unlike you, I don't fall apart when plans change." They stared at each other across my kitchen, like two animals realizing they'd been chained together. And now the chain was all that was keeping them from killing each other. I was watching a machine destroy itself from internal friction. Henrik and Sabine were gears that had worked smoothly when grinding against me, but now they were grinding against each other, generating heat that would eventually seize the entire mechanism. They'd built their partnership on my murder. Now they were discovering that foundations built on betrayal tend to collapse when pressure mounts. Sabine left the room. Henrik stayed in the kitchen holding the credit card statement like evidence of something he should have seen coming. I had what I needed. Explicit confession, documented betrayal, evidence of conspiracy fracturing under its own weight. Day 15 morning. I powered up the CB radio and switched to the frequency Harlan used for his farm operations. "Harlan, this is Warren Prescott," I said into the microphone. "I need you to deliver something to Conrad Lockwood's office in town. Sealed envelope. No questions. Static." Then Harlan's voice came through shocked and warm at the same time. "Warren, Lord Almighty. I knew that barn light was on. Saw it 14 nights running. Didn't say a word to anyone. Figured you had your reasons. 15 days. He'd known I was alive for 15 days and chose silence. Thank you for that," I said. "For the silence. You ain't nobody's business but yours while you're in your own barn. Lot of folks been saying you went missing on a hike. I figured if you wanted to be found, you'd have let yourself be found. I wasn't ready to be found. Now I am. Can you deliver the envelope? Be there in 20 minutes. I wrote the note for Conrad Lockwood estate attorney at Graham and Associates, who held the trust documents Henrik knew nothing about. Single sentence. Clear instructions. I need you to file paperwork establishing I'm alive, and I need Sheriff Hughes to meet me at the barn at 6 p.m. tomorrow with a warrant. I sealed it. Waited. Harlan arrived at the barn exactly 20 minutes later. He looked older than I remembered, 72 years sitting heavier on his shoulders, but his eyes were sharp. "You all right?" he asked, looking at my splinted collarbone, the bruises that had faded from purple to yellow-green. "I am now," I said. "Thank you for not asking questions. Figure you'll tell me when you're ready, or you won't. Either way, envelope's going to Conrad within the hour." I understood loyalty had two languages. Henrik had spoken it loudly while stealing from me, proclaiming, "I love you, Dad," with every transaction. Sabine spoke it convincingly while planning betrayal, performing devotion, while booking one-way flights. But Harlan had spoken it silently for 15 nights, seeing my barn light and choosing not to mention it to anyone, and silence turned out to be the only dialect that meant what it said. Harlan left with the envelope. I watched him drive away in his old pickup truck carrying instructions that would end 15 days of strategic death. I sealed inside it a single sentence for Conrad. By tomorrow evening, Sheriff Hughes would arrive at this barn with a warrant. Henrik and Sabine would be in my house, still planning, still assuming I was dead, still believing their only problems were legal complications and empty bank accounts. They had no idea the biggest complication was about to walk out of a barn and back into life. 15 days of patient observation were ending. The ghost was about to speak, and when he did, everything Henrik and Sabine built on my presumed death would collapse in a single evening. I had one day to prepare, one day to organize evidence, one day to ready myself for the moment I would stop being dead and start being the father who would destroy his son. I spent that night preparing for the confrontation that would end my death. Conrad Lockwood walked into my barn at 3:47 p.m. on day 16, first living person besides me to see what I'd built in 15 days of being dead, and the look on his face told me he understood exactly what kind of operation I'd been running from the shadows. I'd prepared through the night, organized the evidence into folders, labeled the camera footage, transcribed key CB recordings, built a case the way I'd built engines, methodically, piece by piece, every component documented and verified. Harlan had delivered my message. Conrad had come. He stood in the doorway taking it in. The 6-monitor surveillance system, the CB radio setup, the mechanical safe, the workbench covered in documentation, the splint on my collarbone, the bruises that had faded but not disappeared. "Warren," he set his briefcase down carefully. "When Harlan said you were alive, I hoped. When he said you had evidence, I wondered. But this," he walked to the monitors, touched one with his finger like he needed to confirm it was real. "How long have you been here?" 16 days, since October 29th. The day Henrik reported you missing. The day he pushed me off a cliff and left me to die." Conrad turned to look at me. Really look. Not at the evidence or the surveillance equipment, but at me. At what 16 days of survival and documentation had cost. "Show me everything," he said. I did. Camera footage of Henrik positioning me at the cliff edge. The push itself. Grainy but clear enough. My fall. Henrik walking away without checking. The funeral performance for Sheriff Hughes. Sabine photographing my bedroom like inventory. The argument where she said, "Tell them how you pushed your father off a cliff," with audio so clear it could have been recorded in a studio. CB recordings of their planning. Their panic about the missing money. Their discussions of probate timelines and death certificates. Financial documents showing the trust structure they didn't know about. Bank statements proving the money they'd murdered me for was legally untouchable. Minerva's letter warning me 4 years ago that I'd need to protect myself. Conrad reviewed it all for 2 hours. Made notes. Asked questions. Played footage twice, 3 times. Verified timestamps. Checked audio quality. Finally, he sat back. Warren, you have enough for attempted first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Every piece of evidence is admissible. Cameras on your property, legal. CB recordings in public radio space, legal. Financial documents you legally own, admissible. The footage of them arguing her explicit acknowledgement of the crime, prosecutable. I felt the weight of 16 days alone with rage and evidence finally shifting to other shoulders. Conrad seeing the barn base meant I was no longer the only person carrying the truth. The burden felt lighter even though nothing about the truth itself had changed. Just the number of people who knew it. Conrad continued. We need them to confess in front of a third party who isn't you. Right now, the push itself is circumstantial. We have footage showing two figures at a cliff, one falling. Defense will argue accident, that you misinterpreted events due to head trauma. We need them to admit it where someone else can testify. Someone credible. How? I asked. I've been dead for 16 days building a case. How much longer do I need to stay buried? Not much longer. Because your son just gave us the perfect opportunity. Conrad opened his briefcase, pulled out paperwork. Henrik filed paperwork 3 days ago for a November 18th town hall meeting. Public announcement of your presumed death. Preliminary asset division discussion. He's inviting half the county to witness his inheritance claim. Wants to establish community acknowledgement that you're gone, and he's the rightful heir. November 18th, 5 days away. Maiku. He wants the whole town to witness my death and make it official, I said. Fine. Let the whole town witness something else instead. Conrad smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a lawyer who just realized his client handed him a winning case. Exactly. We coordinate with Sheriff Hughes. You walk in at the exact moment Henrik is mid-eulogy. The cameras recordings everything. We present it all right there with 50 witnesses watching him realize his father isn't dead. His reaction, whatever he says, whatever he does. Documented in front of an entire room of people who can testify. I considered what justice looked like when you got to choreograph it. Was it still justice if I chose the stage, the lighting, the exact moment my son's eulogy became his confession? Or did it become theater? Morally justified theater, but performance nonetheless. I didn't know. Maybe it didn't matter. Henrik had chosen the venue. I was just deciding when to walk through the door. What do we do until November 18th? I asked. You stay here. Stay dead. Let them keep planning, keep assuming you're gone. The more comfortable they get, the more devastating your appearance will be. I'll coordinate with Sheriff Hughes. He'll be there with deputies and warrants ready. We time it perfectly. You walk in, Henrik sees you, and we watch his entire narrative collapse in real time. What about Sabine's flight December 20th? She's planning to abandon him. You let her plan it. Better if she's there too. 2 arrests instead of 1. Both of them facing charges. Both of them realizing simultaneously that everything they built on your death just evaporated. Conrad stood, started packing the evidence documentation back into his briefcase, left the originals with me. 5 days, Warren. 5 more days of being dead. Can you manage that? I've managed 16. 5 more won't kill me, though that's more than my son managed to do. Conrad left the barn carrying a briefcase full of evidence I'd spent 16 days collecting. I watched him go knowing November 18th was 5 days away. Henrik was planning a eulogy. Sabine was planning her escape to Cancun. Sheriff Hughes was preparing warrants. And I, 68-year-old retired maintenance technician, was planning the moment I'd walk back from the dead and watch my son's carefully constructed lie collapse in front of everyone who was supposed to witness its triumph. 5 days of final surveillance, final evidence gathering, final patience. Then the ghost would speak, and the dead would walk, and justice would finally look like something other than a father buried in a barn watching his son inherit his murder. Conrad left with copies. I kept the originals. 5 days until November 18th. 2 days before November 18th, my outdoor camera caught Henrik climbing back to the cliff with a canvas bag, and I watched him spend 43 minutes systematically destroying evidence he didn't realize was creating evidence of a different kind. He arrived at 2:17 p.m. on November 16th. Day 19 for me, final cleanup day for him. The canvas bag looked military surplus, the kind with reinforced handles and weatherproof coating. He'd parked his truck a quarter-mile down the fire road, same spot he'd used October 29th, when he'd driven me to my murder. The cliff camera captured everything in high definition. He pulled out hiking boots first. My hiking boots, the ones I'd worn that morning. He examined them for 30 seconds, turning them over, checking the treads. Then he set them on a flat rock and doused them with what looked like lighter fluid from a red plastic bottle. Next came the jacket. My North Face windbreaker forest green, 20 years old. He shook it out, checked the pockets, found nothing because there'd been nothing, then laid it across the boots. Gloves, rope. A small backpack I didn't recognize until I zoomed the footage and saw the Prescott Family Reunion 2019 logo Minerva had ordered custom. He'd kept that bag for 5 years just to use it as evidence disposal. The entire pile took him 8 minutes to arrange. He circled it twice, checking angles, making sure everything would burn completely. Professional caution from an amateur criminal. Then he lit it. The flames went up fast. Lighter fluid does that. He stood back, watching, silhouetted against the smoke like some kind of ritual participant. Wind carried the smoke east, away from town, away from anywhere someone might notice and investigate. At the 22-minute mark, he used a stick to poke at the remains, spreading them out, making sure nothing identifiable survived. The boots were melting. The jacket was ash. The rope had curled into black wire. At the 35-minute mark, he pulled out his phone and took 3 photographs of the burning pile from different angles. I watched him review each photo, delete 1, keep 2. Documentation or insurance or stupidity. I couldn't tell which. Consciousness of guilt, Conrad had called it. When someone destroys evidence after the crime, it proves they knew the crime happened. Henrik was manufacturing his own prosecution. He stayed until 3 p.m. watching the last embers die, then kicked dirt over everything and walked back down the mountain. I saved the footage to 3 separate drives and texted Conrad. Got him destroying evidence. 43 minutes, multiple items, photographs. Day 19. Conrad replied 4 minutes later. Prosecutable, keep recording. Destruction is just creation in reverse. Same energy, opposite outcome. Day 20 was preparation day. I hadn't showered in 20 days. Hadn't changed clothes in 20 days. Hadn't looked in a mirror in 20 days because the barn had no mirrors, and I'd had no reason to see what survival looked like on a face that was supposed to be dead. The house was empty. Henrik and Sabine had driven to Knoxville that morning for what Henrik's calendar called estate attorney consultation, 10 a.m. They'd be gone for hours discussing how to divide assets I'd already secured. I walked across my property like a trespasser. The back door was unlocked. They'd stopped locking it after the first week, stopped treating my house like it still had an owner. Inside smelled different. Sabine's vanilla candles, Henrik's coffee. The absence of 40 years of my routine. I climbed the stairs to my bathroom. The shower took 30 minutes. 20 days of barn dust and sweat and fear came off in layers. The water ran gray, then clear. I used soap Minerva had bought 3 years ago, still sitting in the caddy where she'd left it. And for 90 seconds I stood underwater, hot enough to hurt, and pretended my wife wasn't dead, and my son wasn't a murderer, and November 18th was just another Tuesday. Then I turned the water off and became practical again. Clothes from my closet, charcoal slacks, white button-down navy sweater Minerva had given me for Christmas 2020. I'd worn it to her funeral. Seemed appropriate to wear it to Henrik's reckoning. The mirror showed me what 3 weeks of survival had cost. I'd lost weight, maybe 15 pounds. My face looked carved, angular, older than 68. Gray stubble covered my jaw. My eyes looked like they'd seen things eyes weren't meant to see, which was accurate because I'd watched my son celebrate my murder and plan my estate division and fight with his wife about whether my death was worth the money. I looked like a ghost. Perfect. I shaved, combed my hair, put on my watch. The Timex Minerva had given me on our 30th anniversary. It still worked. Time doesn't stop just because you die. Conrad had texted at 11:47 a.m. Sheriff Hughes coordinated. You walk in at 9:15. We arrest at 9:20. Sabine's warrant processes simultaneously. Everything's synchronized. I replied, understood. Then I walked back to the barn, back to the cameras, back to watching Henrik and Sabine return from Knoxville and discuss probate timelines over dinner while I ate canned soup and waited for November 18th. November 18th, 2024, 9 a.m. Greene County Town Hall smelled like coffee and old carpet, and the particular staleness of government buildings that haven't been renovated since 1987. 32 residents filled the community meeting room. I counted from the hallway window. Henrik stood at the podium wearing his charcoal suit and grief face. Sabine sat front row, tissues in hand. Sheriff Hughes stood at the side exit, positioned exactly where Conrad had promised. Conrad himself sat back row, briefcase on his lap, looking like any other concerned citizen. Henrik's voice carried through the door. My father was a man of routine and integrity, someone who believed in community and hard work and lies dressed in eulogy clothing. I stood in the hallway with my hand on the doorknob, wearing the sweater Minerva had given me, looking like a ghost about to crash his own funeral, listening to my son describe my tragic death to 30 people who believed every word. Conrad had said wait until 9:15. Let Henrik build the lie big enough that the truth would shatter it completely. My watch read 9:14:47. I counted 1, 2, 3, then pushed the door open and stepped into the room where I'd been dead for 21 days, about to make every witness watch resurrection happen in real time. 3. The door opened. The doors opened at exactly 9:17 a.m., and I walked into Greene County Town Hall with a cane in my right hand and 21 days of evidence behind me, stepping into a room where 30 people were mourning a man who wasn't dead. Henrik's voice cut off mid-sentence. He'd been saying something about my dedication to community service. The words died when he saw me. I took 5 steps before anyone moved. My right shoulder was in a splint. White medical fabric crossing my chest arm, immobilized. The cane wasn't decorative. I needed it. I looked exactly like what I was, a man who'd survived 3 weeks after being pushed off a cliff. Someone dropped a coffee cup. Ceramic shattered liquid spreading. No one looked down. Sabine leaped from the front row chair, toppling backward. Her hand went to her mouth, shock that might have been real. Henrik just stared. I walked down the center aisle, cane tapping against tile. The shoulder splint told one story. The bruises on my face told another. The cane told a third. Together they said attempted murder, survival consequence. Henrik's face went through 5 stages in 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, terror. Then something I hadn't expected, shame. Pure, undiluted shame. I stopped 10 feet from the podium. So I heard there was a discussion about my estate, I said. My voice carried in the absolute silence, calm as a maintenance call. I thought I should be here. 32 people sat frozen. My name is Warren Prescott, I said to the room. I'm 68 years old. 3 weeks ago, my son pushed me off a cliff on our mountain property and left me to die. I survived. Harlan Frost sat third row. His face showed recognition, understanding. He nodded once I believe you. Others looked between me and Henrik, trying to reconcile eulogy with accusation, the dead father standing, while the living son stood silent like a defendant who'd forgotten his statement. Sheriff Hughes moved forward, hand on his belt, prepared, not aggressive. Conrad had coordinated everything. Conrad stood from the back row, briefcase in hand, approaching with practiced professionalism. Resurrection isn't metaphor when it happens to you. It's physical. The weight of 32 gazes on a body they thought buried. The sound of your own voice in a room that believed you silenced forever. The moment when you step from death into testimony and feel the difference in your bones. Not relief or triumph, but something stranger, the sensation of existing again after 3 weeks of being a ghost, watching your life get divided among murderers. Sheriff, I have camera footage from Warren's property showing the incident at the cliff on October 29th. Conrad said, handing over a tablet. Audio recordings from legally installed CB radio receivers. Video documentation of evidence destruction at the scene 2 days ago. All legally obtained, all time-stamped, all admissible. The sheriff took the tablet. Watched 15 seconds. Henrik's hands on my back, the push my body falling. His jaw set the way it does when theory becomes evidence. Sabine bolted. She ran for the side exit, heels clicking. She made it 6 steps before Harlan stood and blocked her path, 72 and immovable when it mattered. Ma'am, he said, I think you should stay. Henrik hadn't moved. He stood at the podium, hands gripping wood like it was the only solid thing left. He looked at me, not at the sheriff or Conrad or witnesses, just at me, and his face showed something I'd seen twice before when he was 7 and accidentally killed our family dog and at Minerva's funeral. Recognition of damage that couldn't be undone. Henrik Prescott. Sheriff Hughes said, moving forward. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. I taught Henrik when he was 7, stay quiet when you're angry. Count to 10, think before you speak. He never learned that lesson. Years of impulse emotion shortcuts. Today, the law would force him silent, and the irony wasn't lost on me. The right to remain quiet becoming a right he'd finally have to exercise because he'd never learned to choose it himself. 2 deputies materialized. Professional, efficient, choreographed. One approached Henrik, the other moved toward Sabine. The cuffs made a specific sound when they closed. Metal clicking into place, mechanical certainty, the sound of choices becoming consequences. Henrik's hands disappeared behind his back. Sabine struggled against the deputy's grip, manufactured innocence collapsing into survival instinct. The entire town hall sat in stunned silence as the deputies escorted Henrik and Sabine towards separate exits, separate patrol cars, separate futures that would intersect only in testimony and prosecution. Henrik looked back, once met my eyes, and I saw the boy I'd taught to ride bikes and balance checkbooks become Defendant Prescott in the space between one heartbeat and the next. I stood in the center aisle of Greene County Town Hall, alive and vindicated and fundamentally altered, watching my son disappear through the door while 32 witnesses processed resurrection and arrest and the particular kind of justice that feels nothing like victory. The patrol cars left at 9:43 a.m. I stayed until noon. The booking process at Greene County Sheriff's Department took 47 minutes and involved more paperwork than emotion, which somehow felt appropriate after spending 21 days building a case, one recorded conversation at a time. I sat in the waiting area while Sheriff Hughes processed Henrik and Sabine through separate intake stations. Gray plastic chairs, fluorescent lighting the smell of burned coffee and industrial cleaner. The building felt like every government office I'd ever entered, designed for function, not comfort, a place where people's lives get reduced to forms and case numbers and filing systems. Conrad sat beside me, briefcase on his lap, reviewing documents on his tablet. Through the safety glass partition, I could see Henrik standing at the booking counter, facing forward for the photograph, turning left for profile, turning right. Mechanical movements. His hands were still cuffed behind his back. The deputy took fingerprints. Right thumb, right index, right middle, working through each finger with practiced efficiency. 20 feet away in a separate processing station, Sabine was already talking. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I recognized the body language. Leaning forward, urgent gestures, despite the handcuffs, eyes moving between the deputy and the door like she was calculating escape routes that didn't exist anymore. She spoke for 3 minutes straight before the deputy handed her a phone. Public defender, probably, or plea negotiation. Conrad looked up from his tablet. "Are you all right? This must be... I can't imagine what you're feeling right now." "I've been better these last 20 days than I was the 20 before that," I said. "Now it's just paperwork. I'm good at paperwork." And it was true. 40 years as a maintenance technician meant 40 years of work orders, repair logs, inventory sheets, compliance forms. I documented thousands of broken systems and fixed equipment and routine inspections. This felt like the same process. Identify the problem, document the damage, follow the procedure, file the forms. Sheriff Hughes emerged from the processing area at 12:14 p.m., clipboard in hand. "Charges are filed. Henrik Prescott attempted first-degree murder, class a felony under Tennessee law, 15 to 60 years. Conspiracy to commit murder, elder financial abuse. Sabine Prescott, same charges. Both being held without bail, pending arraignment, Monday morning." He paused, looked at me directly. "Sabine's already requested legal representation and indicated willingness to cooperate. She's asking for reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Henrik. The partnership that had conspired to murder me dissolved in the first hour of custody. Sabine betraying Henrik exactly as she'd planned to betray him. Not December 20th in Cancun, but November 18th in booking, trading him for a shorter sentence, the same way she'd have traded him for a one-way ticket if the bank account had been full." Conrad made a sound that might have been disgust or vindication or both. "That was fast," I said. Sheriff Hughes nodded. "Usually is. Conspiracies fall apart when consequences show up. She's claiming coercion, manipulation, diminished capacity. District attorney will evaluate the offer." He handed me a form. Victim impact statement. Blank lines where I was supposed to describe how the crime had affected my life, what I'd lost, what justice should look like. Standard procedure in felony prosecutions. I took the pen and started filling it out. Name, address, relationship to defendant, date of incident. Mechanical routine. Conrad watched me write, probably expecting emotion or hesitation or something more dramatic than careful penmanship and factual description. But this was what justice actually looked like. Not the dramatic confrontation at the town hall. That was theater, necessary, but anomalous. This was the real work arrest forms, evidence logs, victim impact statements, booking sheets. Justice was mostly paperwork, exhausting and routine and necessary, and completely devoid of the satisfaction I'd thought it would bring. The surveillance had taught me to process tragedy as documentation, and now documentation was all I had left. I finished the form and handed it back. "District attorney will be in touch about trial proceedings," Sheriff Hughes said. "Could be 6 months, could be a year. Depends on plea negotiations and court schedules." I nodded and stood to leave. "Warren," Conrad said, not moving. "You don't have to stay for this. You've done enough. I know, I said, but I'm already here. November 19th, 24 hours after the arrests. Conrad called at 8:47 a.m. Henrik's asking to see you. Says he needs to talk. You're under no obligation. I can tell the detention center you're declining. I thought about it for 11 seconds. I'll go. I need to sign the final statement anyway. The detention center interrogation room was smaller than it looked on television. 8 by 10 feet gray walls, metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs on either side. Henrik sat on the far side wearing Orange County issue jumpsuit, hands folded on the table. No handcuffs because this was voluntary contact, not custodial interrogation. He looked at me without Sabine beside him for the first time in 3 years. No one to give instructions or confirm strategy or tell him what to say. I sat down, said nothing. Dad, His voice cracked on the word. Sabine told me you didn't really love me, that you only kept the money to control me, to keep me dependent. I believed her. Silence. He waited for response, reassurance, something, which hurt worse for Henrik. Believing a woman who said his father didn't love him, or trying to kill that father to prove the love didn't matter. Or discovering in this room that the woman had lied about everything, including whether she'd stay to face consequences beside him. I didn't come here for an apology or an explanation, I said. I came to sign the victim impact statement for the district attorney. I know, he said quietly. But I wanted you to know why. What she said. What I thought. He wanted me to say I loved him. Wanted absolution. Wanted me to make this hurt less. But I'd spent 21 days earning the right to walk away, and that's exactly what I did. I stood, pushed the chair back, walked toward the door without answering the question he hadn't quite asked. He called behind me, just the word hanging in air. I knocked twice for the guard. The security door unlocked with a metallic click that sounded final in a way the arrest hadn't. Henrik would spend 15 to 60 years wondering if his father loved him, and I would spend however many years I had left, knowing I chose silence over absolution. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because some questions deserve to live unanswered. 4 days after Henrik's interrogation, I sat in Conrad's office signing amendments to the trust I'd established 6 months before my son tried to kill me. Conrad's office looked the same as September. Same oak desk, same leather chairs, same framed degrees documenting 30 years of legal practice. But I was different, 30 pounds lighter shoulder, still healing 3 weeks of survival, changing how I calculated what mattered. The irrevocable trust is untouchable, Conrad said, sliding the first document across. Established April 15th, 2024, 6 months before the incident. That timing matters. April 15th. Minerva had been dead 2 months. Henrik had already started pulling away, asking pointed questions about when I planned to update my will. Maybe some part of me had known before my conscious mind did. Maybe survival instinct builds protection before the threat becomes fully visible. The trust held everything, the house at 850,640 acres of mountain land retirement accounts, life insurance. $2.05 million behind legal walls Henrik's conspiracy couldn't penetrate. I want to amend the property disposition, I said. Sell the house, add proceeds to the trust, but the mountain land stays permanently. No sale provision, no transfer option, no future discretion. Conrad paused. Most people want flexibility. You're making it untouchable forever. That is where I survived, I said. No one gets to sell it. He wrote the language carefully, then looked up. You need to name a beneficiary. Who inherits when you're gone? Leave it blank for now. Warren, I used to think I knew who my family was, I said. Turns out I was wrong for 38 years. I'm not making that mistake twice. He left the line empty. Land is the only honest relationship I had left. It held me when I fell, caught me in branches that should have broken. It hid me when I needed shelter, gave me the barn and the vantage point to watch my betrayers incriminate themselves. Unlike sons or wives or money, land doesn't lie about what it is or what it costs to keep it. I signed 3 copies. My signature looked different than April, shakier, older, but still legally binding, still protecting what I'd built even with no one left to build it for. Conrad handed me copies. No one can touch it now. Good, I said and stood. Warren, he said as I reached the door. Are you all right beyond the legal questions? I've been better at paperwork than emotion for 40 years, I said. No reason to change now. November 28th. I drove to the detention center at 2 p.m. One last visit before the December hearing. Conrad had advised against it. But I had one sentence left to deliver, and I wanted to say it to his face. Henrik sat behind reinforced glass in an orange jumpsuit. He'd lost weight. His face looked thinner, closer to 40 than 38. I picked up the receiver. He picked up his. 5 seconds of silence. I lost my son the day you pushed me down the mountain, I said. Today, I only meet a stranger. I replaced the receiver without waiting for response. He leaned forward, mouth moving behind the glass. I didn't pick the phone back up. Behind me, I heard his palm hit the glass once, twice, desperate, the sound of someone trying to stop a conversation, already finished. I walked through the door without looking back. Freedom and loss feel identical at 68. The question wasn't what justice won. The question was whether what remains after justice is enough to call a life. 10 days after Henrik's final visitation, I drove back to the cliff where my son had pushed me. A cold December morning. I needed to reclaim the place rather than let it remain a wound. The mountain road looked unchanged. Same gravel switchbacks, same tree line, same layered Appalachian ridges dissolving into distance. But I was different, shoulder-healing body, relearning how to carry the weight of what had happened. I parked at 6:47 a.m. Breath visible in the cold air. Sky moving from dark to gray to that particular winter clarity Tennessee does better than anywhere. 12 minutes up the trail, left foot, right foot cane tapping against frozen ground. The cliff edge looked smaller than memory had made it. Trauma inflates, everything turns 60 feet into a bottomless void. Standing here now, I saw it plainly, rock face, steep drop, survivable if lucky. I stood in the exact spot where Henrik had pushed me. This time, no one stood behind me. I unscrewed the thermos. Black coffee, no sugar, the same way I'd been drinking it for 40 years. Steam rose and mixed with pine and cold air. Then I pulled out Minerva's letter, written 4 years before she died, sealed with the instruction, open only when you need it most. I read it one final time. Warren, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong, and I'm not there. You've given Henrik everything, time, money, second chances. You're a good father. Better than he deserved, though I hate writing that. Don't give so much that you forget to care for yourself. You're allowed to walk away from people who take more than they give, even when those people are family. Love, Minerva. She had known 4 years before I did. I folded the letter and placed it in my breast pocket. Not back in a drawer. She was coming with me. I watched the sunrise break over the ridges. No tears, no prayers, no dramatic declarations. Just standing, breathing, reclaiming the ground beneath my feet. Henrik had tried to erase me from this spot. Instead, I'd returned alone and alive and transformed his intended gravesite into something quieter and more permanent than revenge. I walked back to the truck and started driving. The radio came on automatically, WKTN, the country station programmed since 1989. An old song about roads and leaving and not knowing your destination. Minerva used to sing along, off-key and enthusiastic. I'd pretend to complain. She'd swat my hand away laughing. I didn't turn it off. I drove down the mountain with nowhere particular to go. Maybe west? Maybe until the gas ran out. Maybe until I found a town that needed a maintenance technician willing to start over with nothing but a truck, a thermos, and a letter over his heart. 68 years old, 2.05 million in protected assets, 640 acres of mountain land, no son to fund, no wife except in memory, no plan for the first time in 38 years. The freedom felt less like victory and more like vertigo, that suspended moment between falling and landing when your body keeps moving anyway. I pressed the accelerator and leaned into the curve, because uncertainty isn't the opposite of hope. Sometimes it's the only honest version of it. And to you listening to my story, remember this. For 38 years, I believed that being a good father meant giving everything, time, money, second chances. I ignored the warning signs my wife saw years before she died. My mistake wasn't loving my son. It was refusing to see that love can't fix someone who's already chosen betrayal. Sometimes family justice means accepting that the people who should protect you are the ones you need protection from most. When I fell 60 feet and survived, I didn't know why God spared me. But spending 21 days in that barn watching Henrik plan my estate division, that's when I understood. Family justice isn't about revenge. It's about refusing to let betrayal define the rest of your life. This is what Dad's revenge stories teach us. You don't have to choose between forgiveness and self-protection. Sometimes walking away is the strongest thing you can do. Sometimes justice means choosing your own peace over someone else's redemption, even when that someone is your son. If you've made it this far, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my position? Do you think family justice can ever truly feel complete? Leave a comment below. Your perspective matters. If this story resonated with you, please share it. Subscribe to Wise Revenge for more Dad's revenge stories. Each one carries lessons about standing up for yourself when family fails you. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means everything to me. One final note, while this story is based on real emotions and real lessons about family justice, certain details have been adjusted for storytelling purposes. The message, the importance of protecting yourself, even from those closest to you, that's what I hope you carry forward.